Okay, this is another video showing some of the basic animation tools in 3ds Max. So for this one we're going to head over and create a sphere. Okay, so we're going to start with a sphere in the Create panel. So we're going to click on Sphere, click and drag in the perspective view, and if you want you can punch in 2 feet for the size. Segments are set to 32, and you can change the color if you want as well. So I'm going to choose, this time instead of just the 3ds Max palette, I'm going to use the AutoCAD palette. So there's more colors in here. I'm just going to make this yellow. And I'm going to click on Maximize Viewport Toggle and just look at this in perspective. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into a Pac Man chomping, and we're just going to have it follow a path and chomp some pellets. Okay, so again, I'm going to change the view from realistic to shaded. And in the properties for the sphere, which you can actually rename Pac Man if you want, I'm going to turn on Slice On. Okay, so just in case you've deselected the sphere, if you click on the sphere and go to the Modify panel, you can get back into the parameters here. So I'm going to turn on Slice On, and I'm going to adjust the slice from just by holding my mouse button down and dragging the value. So I just want something like this for now. I just want to know which way I need to rotate this because I want it to be straight on the grid. Okay, so if I look at my view cube, I'm looking towards the front here. I want to rotate this around so it's standing up in the front. Okay, so I'm going to use angle snaps for that. So you can turn on Select and Rotate, and over here you've got the 2 snap toggles. You've got snaps and angle snaps. I'm going to turn on angle snaps, but I'm going to right click on angle snaps and change the angle to 45 or 90. I like to use 45. So I'm going to switch it to 45, and then if I rotate along just the x-axis, I can snap it twice and it'll be standing straight up on the grid. Okay, so I'm going to hit F to go to the front view just to set up the animation. So I want to adjust the slice from and the slice to so that it looks like his mouth is open. So he's going to start in the open position, then we're going to turn on Auto Key and go to frame 10, and we're going to close his mouth. So we're going to adjust slice to and slice from with Auto Key turned on. If you go too far through, it's going to start a new sphere, so you want to come just before the point where it does that. And then you can scrub the timeline back and forth to see the chomp happening. Okay, so if we go from frame 0 to frame 10, we've got a chomping Pac Man. So there's 2 ways you can have this animation loop. So the first thing is you can grab both the keys that we've set, and you could just hold Shift. If you hold Shift and put your mouse over the keyframe, it changes to the double-headed arrow, and you can drag a copy of the keys. Okay, so I would stop at frame 20. You could grab the whole thing again, and you could just keep copying these across. So if I hit play, it's just going to keep chomping until it gets to the end. Okay, so the other way to do that, I'm going to hit Control Z to undo. The other thing you can do to create a looping animation is to open up the curve editor. Okay, so I've got the curve editor opened with the Pac Man selected. So over here in the left, you're going to see Pac Man listed here. So what we've been animating is the actual object parameters. So I'm going to go down and find Object Sphere. Okay, so if you hit the plus and expand that, now you see in the curve editor you've got your handles here, and slice from and slice to are highlighted. Okay, so with those highlighted, I'm going to go up to Edit and down to Controller and out of range types. So you have to make sure these are actually selected. So I'm going to click on both of them, hold Shift, make sure keys are selected, go back up to Edit, Controller. Now I can select out of range types. Okay, so in here you could choose loop. It was set to constant. If I switch it to loop and click OK, the animation is going to loop. But it snaps back to the beginning because we need another key past frame 10. So we need to copy frame 0 to frame 20 in order for this to loop properly. So what I'm going to do is select on the main timeline frame 0. I'm going to hold Shift and drag a copy to frame 20, and then you'll see that's going to balance out the loop. Okay, so now I have a looping chomp. So the bonus to using the curve editor and doing it this way is that now if I want to speed it up, I can just grab all three keys, and as long as you've got select range turned on, which again, if you right click and go to filter on the timeline, sorry, not filter, configure, make sure show selection range is checked on. Okay, so from here I could shorten this to speed it up, and now he's going to be chomping faster. So that affects the entire loop. Okay, so I'm going to close the curve editor. I'm going to hit P to go to perspective, and you can see in perspective if I hit play, he's chomping away in 3D. I'm going to hit G to turn off the grid and just have a look without the grid on. Okay, so G is the shortcut for the grid. I'll turn it back on for a minute. What we'll do now is turn off auto key and go to the top view. Okay, so just to show you what we're looking at, if I rotate the view in top view, I'm in orthographic now. It's still flat, but I can see he's chomping this way. He's going to go to the right. So if I go to the top view, I want to make sure I'm going to draw a path from the direction he's looking at right now, and I'm going to have him constrained to the path that I create. So to create a path, we're going to use the line tool. So if you go up to create, we're going to go over to shapes, and we're going to click on line. So if we're in the top view, we can be sure that we're creating the line flat on the grid. So to use the line tool, it's like using the line tool in Photoshop or Illustrator. Before I start creating a line, I've got the line tool turned on, but down here under creation method, I'm going to set drag type to Bezier. So what's going to happen is if I click on the middle of Pac Man and then I click and let go and drag, you're going to see a line come out here. So if I click again and I hold the mouse button down and move the mouse, it starts to create a curved line. So when I let go, if I keep moving the mouse, it continues to curve around. So I can use this to make an S-shaped pattern. Okay, so I'm clicking and dragging, letting go, clicking, dragging, letting go. When I get to the end, I'm going to click, and then I'm going to right click to end, and that ends the creation of the line. Okay, so if you want to edit the line once you've created it, you can go into the Modify panel, and down here you can see under Selection, you can select all the different sub-objects within the line. So you've got Vertex. Everywhere where we clicked in the viewport to create the line, it drops a vertex that you can edit. So if I use the Select and Rotate or the Select and Move tool, I can click on each one. And you can see when I click on a vertex, it has the handles for the Bezier, so you can change the curve just by moving the Bezier handles around. Okay, so you can scale them out by pulling them out, or you can rotate them by moving them. If you want to select the whole vertex and move it, just select it and move it between the Y and X axis. You can select segments in between those vertexes or vertices. You can select the whole thing as a spline, and you can refine the segments by selecting either vertex or segment, and you can go down and find refine. Okay, so there's a section for refine. If you click on refine, you can add more vertices to the spline. Okay, so once you've added them, you can delete them just by selecting and hitting delete on the keyboard. Okay, so we've got our line. I'm going to hit P, go back to perspective. I'm going to turn off my subselection. So I'm just back to the object. And at this point I'm going to turn off the grid again. I'm going to hit G. And what we want to do now is select the Pac Man. And we want to constrain him to follow the path when the animation plays. Okay, so my timeline is set to 100. So if I use path constraints right now, it's going to make the animation between frame 0 and frame 100. So to do this, I'm going to go up to Animation, Constraints. Remember to make sure Pac Man is selected. We're going to go down to Path Constraint. So if I move my mouse, it's searching for the path that I want to use. So I'm going to pick on the line. And now over here on the right, it's going to bring you into Pac Man's motion panel. And you're going to see under Position List, we have a path constraint. Okay, so his position is constrained to this line. So what happens is if I scroll down, you're going to see you have all these different options to control the animation along the path. So if I hit play, you'll see that he takes off with the line, but he's not following the path yet. Okay, so he's stuck to the path, but he doesn't rotate and turn to face down the path. So if you want to have him turn and face the path when he gets to these corners, under path parameters, don't forget to turn on follow. Once you check on follow and you hit play, he now turns with the path. So if you had an object that started out facing a different direction, you could always rotate the object after you've done this. So if I wanted him to go backwards, I'd just turn him backwards and he would travel down backwards. So I'm going to hit undo. He's going to be facing forward. And I'm just going to point out, if you select your line and you go to your modify panel and click on vertex, I'm going to hit F3 to put it in wireframe mode. And just look through here underneath Pac Man. You can see the first vertex on the line is yellow. Okay, so that yellow vertex indicates that that's the first vertex in the line. And anytime you use a path constraint, it's going to start from the first vertex. So if I was to take the last vertex on the line and right click and change it to make it the first vertex, so you click on make first, now that's the first vertex and the animation starts from there. Okay, so I'll switch it back. And I'll hit F3 to get out of see-through mode. The other thing you can do is, you'll notice that the path is kind of choppy around the curves. So if you go under interpolation, you can turn up the steps. So if you bump this up using the arrows, if I go up to 12 or even 14, it's going to add more vertices underneath, and it's going to create a smoother line. Okay, so this doesn't add more selection vertices. It adds more vertices to the actual line. If I was to convert this to If this was a closed path and I converted it to editable poly, you'd see a whole bunch of vertices along the edges here. Okay, so what we'll do next is we're going to create some pellets for him to chomp. So we'll go back to the create panel, back to geometry. We'll make another sphere. Okay, so the sphere size, we'll make it so it's big enough to see, so we'll make it 0.8. And you can change it to whatever color you want. I'll make it white. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use the spacing tool to copy a bunch of these spheres out along the path. Okay, so if you want, you could rename it pellet. So I'm just going to move this one out of the way for a minute. So if you click on the sphere or the pellet and you go up to tools, so you go to tools and then you go down to align, and from align you can use the spacing tool, which the shortcut is Shift I. So I'm going to click on the spacing tool and the spacing tool parameters pop up. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick the path. So I'm going to click pick path. I'll click on my spline, and then down here beside count I'm going to add the number of pellets that I want to have. So I'll just add 6 for now. So down under type of object, we're going to make sure that these are a copy. Normally when you copy out a bunch of the same object, you want it to be an instance, but in this case I'm going to make it a copy because I'm going to animate each one of these to disappear when he passes over them. Okay, so it's going to be a copy. I'm going to click apply and close. So you can take your original and delete it, and you can also take the first one and delete it as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is set up some animation on each one of these so that as soon as Pac-Man crosses past or over the sphere, it's going to disappear. Okay, so when he gets to this frame here, one frame past where you don't see the sphere anymore, I'm going to turn on auto key. I'm going to right click on that sphere, go into object properties, and I'm going to animate the visibility right here. So it's set to 1 right now. If I right click, it's going to set it to 0, and I'll click OK, and it's going to set a key. So what happens now though is if I scrub back to frame 0, it fades the transparency from 0 to frame 21 where I've set the key. Okay, so I'm going to go to frame 21. I'll step back a frame, right click on the sphere again, back into object properties, and we're going to set this to 1 this time. Okay, so that's going to keep the transparency from frame 0 to 20 at 1, and then it's going to switch off at frame 21. Okay, so I can do the same thing for each sphere. So he's going to get here. At this point it's disappeared. So I'm going to right click, go to object properties, set it to 0, go back 1 frame, object properties, set it to 1. Click OK. So when he hits the sphere, when he goes past it, it disappears. Okay, so I'll do the same thing for each one, and then I'll have an animation of Pac-Man eating all these pellets. Okay, so here it's gone. Right click, object properties, set it to 0, step back 1 frame, do the same thing, set it to 1. Okay, so I'll leave the last one since the animation ends there. Okay, so if I hit play and watch, each pellet disappears as Pac-Man crosses over it. Okay, so that's just an example of using animation path constraints and using the loop settings through the curve editor. So I'm going to save this. So this will be Pac Man Example. And then we're going to line up the view in perspective. And you can go to rendering, render setup. Make sure your settings are the same. We're going to switch the output to HD TV and switch it to 1280 by 720. Okay, so then if you want, you can click on the plus in the viewport. We'll go to configure viewports and we'll turn on save frames. Okay, so show save frames in active view, click apply, click OK. Make sure your animation lines up and it's nicely framed like this. So if you want, before we do this, you can change the color of your line. If you wanted to add thickness to the line, you could go into the modify panel and up towards the top under rendering you can turn on enable in renderer and enable in viewport. Okay, so enable in renderer is going to make the line show up with thickness when you hit F9, so when you render. If you don't have that turned on, it's going to show up in the viewport, but when I render it's still not there. So down the road that's going to be useful when we're creating controllers for characters, but for now we'll keep them both checked on. You can adjust the thickness down here under radial. You could also switch it to rectangular, so you could make this shaped like a box or a ribbon, but we're going to stay with the radial and just keep it so it's not too thick. And then we're going to go up to tools, grab viewport, create preview animation. So from here I'm going to use 100%, so it should be 1280 by 720 or however high you can get it to go. Under display filter you could turn on shapes if you want. If you didn't add thickness to the line, if you turn on shapes it'll show up. And then we're using the same settings as before, so render level is shaded, output is AVI with the Microsoft Video 1, and you can set the compression quality to 100 and then click OK. I'm going to click create. So in your preview you should see the pellets disappear as Pac-Man goes over them. And then it plays back in Windows Media Player. So I'm going to send this to the library and I'm going to save it from here. So again, you'll have to right click and go File, Save As if it's a newer version of Windows. I'm on Windows 7, so I can just click File, Save As, and I'll save it to the desktop and move it later. Okay, so this one's going to be Pac Man Example, and then your first and last name. Okay, so if you've hit save, you can save the file again and it should show up on your desktop. Okay, so this file is going to go in the same Dropbox as the first animation with the box. And that's it for this one.